Welcome to Crash Course, a podcast about business, political, and social disruption, and what we can learn from it. I'm Tim O'Brien. Today's Crash Course: Barbie versus the men and the real world. Barbie, the summer blockbuster about the world's most famous doll, has a lot to say about the intersection of art and commerce. It also has a lot to say about gender, identity, and a life well lived, of course. But one reason it has raked in more than $1 billion in global box office sales is because it offers a provocative and funny send-up of mind-numbing, soul-crushing corporate conformity. Barbie is totemic and has the power to brainwash, inspire, derail, and draw in the girls who have played with her for decades. The movie explores all of that, largely unflinchingly, even if it does pull a few of its punches. And Mattel Inc., the toy company that Barbie built, has supported the entire endeavor. It seems to have let the film's director, Greta Gerwig, along with her co-writer, Noah Baumbach, play with the brand's meaning like a yo-yo. Mattel may be having the last laugh. It's raking in handsome piles of cash from all of this, at movie theaters, in sales of related merch, and in its newfound role as the purveyor of franchise toys that can be made into Boffo franchise films. Mattel's stock price began climbing about a month before Barbie's July 21st nationwide release, adding about $1 billion or so to the company's market value. Tolerance can pay off. All of this becomes very meta, trying to sort out the meaning of corporate identity and possible predation in a film that has multiple real-world links and wants to give everybody, women, men, Alan and Midge, we'll talk about them later, and Mattel, a second chance. Joining me today to unpack this is Emma Gray. Emma is the co-host of her own podcast that recaps dating reality shows. Love to see it. And she is the author of A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance. She's also a columnist with MSNBC. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Tim. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about Barbie.
I'm so excited to learn from you about Barbie, and we've got a lot to discuss. So let's just ask the big thing first. Did you like the movie?
I did like the movie. I loved it. In fact, I think part of it was just that I was so excited to finally have a collective film experience that I was excited to get involved with. And I went and saw the movie on the Thursday that it was coming out at 4:30 p.m. by Prospect Park. And the theater was filled. And it was filled with a really diverse crowd of people of all ages. There were children, there were men, there were women. Everyone was wearing pink, and it just really felt like an event. And then the movie itself kind of blew me away. I think, as you outlined, like, this is a Mattel movie, and you understand that there are going to be limitations to a movie that is produced by a brand. And yet they really seem to give Greta Gerwig a lot of creative license and a long leash. And what she ended up producing was much more complex and thought-provoking and a lot more joyful than I think I had anticipated.
And poignant. Tear-jerking in a couple moments even.
Oh my God. When I was leaving the theater, this guy right in front of me turned to his friend and was like, "That messed me up." Like, I was sobbing. I did not expect to cry during the Barbie movie, that is for sure. And I definitely did.
I think it's one of the triumphs of the film is that it's not easily categorizable, if that's even a word, right? Because it's sort of a comedy, but it's also has real human drama in it. And it's kind of a musical, but it's also lampoons musicals. And as you note, Mattel cooperated, but Mattel also gets like repeatedly savage throughout. So there's all of these trippy imbalances that keep you engaged, I think, and keep you thinking.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think the movie has a lot of layers. Like, you can enjoy it just on a pure frothy performance level where the visuals are absolutely stunning. There are enough good jokes to keep you in. You can also enjoy it on the level of asking yourself, what is this movie saying about the way that our culture approaches gender and masculinity specifically? Like, I think this is a feminist movie, but I also think in that is a real interest in men and men's experiences and the way that men are also punished under the weight of gendered expectations.
And trapped by it.
Exactly.
You know, like all those bros like Ryan Gosling in that stupid fur coat.
Oh my God,
right?
yeah.
He's trapped.
Which I think a lot of people have noted that really echoes one of the like QAnon January 6th guy's outfit. And so there are all of these connections that I think you can make. And I think it's intentionally left kind of open-ended. And yeah, Ken's journey to me was really fascinating because you have a guy that's portrayed as a little bit of a doofus, but ultimately is such a repressed person under the weight of masculinity that he doesn't even know who he is. And that's his journey.
And poor Ken just wants to be loved by Barbie.
I know. I actually really enjoyed that they didn't go the route of making this fundamentally a romantic story. I enjoyed that Barbie and Ken's relationship, which obviously if you played with the dolls, you assume these two are in love. These two are a package deal. And the journey of both Barbie and Ken in this movie is to figure out who they are as individuals, separate from the ideas of their creators and separate from their relationship to each other.
And, you know, she has little time for him throughout the movie. As you point out, you know, that it never evolved into them consummating their relationship. She's bored by him before she discovers her own need to escape. And then once she escapes, she's disgusted by it. So it never really comes back to anything positive.
Yeah, there's a great moment towards the beginning where he asks to stay over and she just looks at him and says, "I don't want you here." And there is something kind of great about that. And I also think that it gives us empathy for Ken, who a lot of his anger comes from this feeling of rejection at the hands of Barbie and the fact that he doesn't know how to find self-worth outside of his ability to either sort of collect Barbie as a trophy, a romantic trophy, or once he introduces patriarchy into Barbie land, a way to control her and dominate her.
In the same way that the corporation controls her and dominates her.
Yes.
You know, literally tries to put her back into a box. That scene, you know, when Barbie, I guess we're introducing every possible spoiler in this podcast.
We are. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, sorry. But I mean, the movie's been out for a month almost. So, you know, if you're not on it enough to see the movie before you listen to this podcast, you're in trouble. You know, in terms of the company dominating Barbie, both literally in the real world and women's sense of themselves physically and intellectually and socially, and then in myriad ways throughout the film, there is all of this sort of meta back and forth between the real world and the Barbie world, both in the film and then in our own realities. That still has my head spinning when I think about the meaning of all of it. But, you know, this is a Warner Brothers film that was done in collaboration with Mattel. What do you know about how much authentic leeway they gave Margot Robbie and Greta Gerwig to produce, direct, and write the film that they wanted to do?
My understanding is that they actually gave them all a surprising amount of leeway. I read that at least one executive from Mattel did fly in and tried to get Greta Gerwig to cut a particularly poignant scene in which Barbie, when she is in the real world, is at a bus station and looks over on the bench and sees this much older woman. And she is struck by her because, of course, in Barbie land, no one ages. And she looks over at this old woman and she says, "You're so beautiful." And the woman looks at her and laughs and says, "I know I am." And I think Mattel
wanted that
Yes,
cut?
they felt it was off-brand. They didn't understand what it was giving to the film. And Greta Gerwig said to them, "If you cut that, I don't know what this film is about." Like, that is so fundamental. When you watch the movie, you're like, that's the whole thing, right? That's Barbie seeing a human being in all of their glory. And that's ultimately the journey that she goes on, deciding to become not just an idea, not just something that someone else plays with, but a person in her own right. And part of being a human is aging. And so I think that that was really wild to me that they wanted to cut that, and also impressive that Greta Gerwig was able to put her foot down and say, like, no, that stays in. That's fundamental to what this film is about.
When you were leading into the description of that scene, I thought you were going to talk about a different scene that I had also heard Mattel wanted cut, which is when, you know, when Barbie first shows up in the real world and she's in her cowboy outfit or cowgirl outfit or whatever, and she goes to the high school and she first encounters Sasha sitting with her friends and wants to be friends with them. And Sasha basically says that you're disgusting and reprehensible because you give young girls like me, young women like me, a horrible sense of body image and our place in the world, and we want nothing to do with you. And you see this hurt on Barbie's eyes. She was just trying to make friends, and she's forced now to go off and think about other new things.
Now this teenager is calling her a fascist.
Yes. And Barbie has I think this is one of the great jokes from the movie. Barbie says, I can't be a fascist because I don't control the railways or commerce.
Oh my God. I died. I loved that. And it was one of the indications that you're like, this movie is appropriate for kids, but this is a movie for adults who like used to play with Barbie or who have a strained relationship with the brand of Barbie because of what it represented and kind of all of those things that Sasha and her friends outline with disdain towards Barbie. And I think ultimately, I mean, we see the numbers. Mattel must be feeling pretty good about the fact that they allowed Greta and Noah to poke fun at them and to bring that self-awareness into the movie. Like, I just think it would have been harder to swallow if there wasn't that element of poking fun at themselves in it. It feels like less of an advertisement, even though that's definitely still in there. It kind of allows this IP to be used as a Trojan horse to talk about other bigger things. And that ultimately is good for the brand of Barbie.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is so amazing because, they don't sanitize the image of Mattel or the decades-long legacy of how Barbie has alternately screwed up young people's minds. Mm-hmm. I say this as a boy who's a veteran of being Ken with my sister's Barbie dolls and my neighbor's Barbie dolls. I can name a lot of the different Barbies, but also in some ways empowered them, right? Because there were the Barbie dolls who were professionals in the real world. Well, in the Barbie world, meant to give, lay out goals for young women in the real world. To be a doctor or to be the president or to be a teacher, to be independent, to have your own money. That sort of Mary Tyler Moore era of feminism that had one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world.
Absolutely.
And that's a really hard balance to pull off, I think, in a narrative in which you want viewers to understand that you understand that there is some predatory aspects to this brand while simultaneously having empowering aspects that coexist together, and you may not realize that till you become an adult.
I think that's why you have to hire a really skilled writer or set of writers to pull something like this off. And I think that it's useful for us to be able to grapple with cultural products that are not perfectly one set of values or another. Like, I was very struck by the history of Barbie and the idea that before Barbie, the majority of dolls were baby dolls and were meant to teach young girls to do domestic labor. And so in that way, Barbie was progressive. And in lots of other ways, Barbie was very regressive. And we have to be able to hold both truths at the same time. And I think that that is an interesting duality to hold.
Well, and that's, the opening scene of the entire movie sets that up where you get this riff. It's sort of both an homage and a criticism of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Dawn of Man scene where the dudes beat each other over the head with bones. And she updates that to these little girls breaking up their tea sets with their old dolls. And instead of the monolith that you get in 2001, you get Barbie, whatever, a 50-foot Barbie, looming over all of them as they bow down to this figure that is alternately liberating and imprisoning.
Yes.
And it's trippy.
It is. It is. And then the whole movie kind of, like, it sets the tone that we're gonna do both. It sets that from the first few minutes, and then you're in for just a wild ride throughout. I mean, I can't believe this movie has, like, a Space Odyssey homage and then also an extended Ryan Gosling musical theater dream sequence. I mean, it's incredible.
Some of the various stuff I've read about the film and about Greta Gerwig's role. Some critics have said that she's a complete sellout for having collaborated at all with Mattel, that if she really wanted to do this right, it would have been independent of them and their participation. What do you think of that critique?
I think that that is a nice idea if we were living in a perfect world where all access was equal. But we are living in a capitalist society, and we are living in a culture where we are going to be bombarded with advertisements all the time, whether or not we choose to buy into those things. And so I just think to ask someone to be that pure in their art is not realistic if they want that art to be widely seen. And I think that there is a certain magic in creating this big, splashy event that so many people are going to go out in the theater and see and think, and then they're thinking about it and they're talking about it. And suddenly we have a million op-eds about, like, does this film enforce the binary too much? What is it saying about masculinity? Like, these are conversations that I think wouldn't be happening as centrally in the public center if you didn't have that Barbie brand attached to it. And, like, it goes back to that holding two truths thing where, like,
yes,
it's not a perfect political statement. It also could really advance conversations for people who aren't inclined to want to dive into these deeper conversations naturally about patriarchy, about toxic masculinity, about what women face in our culture still. And so I'm just, like, happy she got on board.
Yeah, the duality throughout. The movie's construct embraces the lesson it's trying to teach, was that we have to try to accept one another despite our flaws or our lack of self-awareness. And she even extends that argument to the corporation.
Yeah.
And, the absolutely nutso C-suite, populated entirely by men in dark suits, in dark ties, that Barbie encounters when she first arrives at real world Mattel. What do you make of those guys in the C-suite and the CEO portrayed by Will Ferrell as another trope in the movie?
I think this was the part of the movie that worked maybe the least well for me. Like, I do think they are trying to thread that needle of acknowledging that this is a corporation dominated by white men, and also being like, but they're nice and they care and they don't want Ken to take over because they care about little girls. And it's not that convincing to me. Like, I was glad there were at least a couple of references to, like, well, this is going to make a lot of money, and that being a clear imperative for all of these people. But I think the Will Ferrell character is doofy, and also they go to great lengths to make sure that you know that he cares about the purity of Barbie and, like, making magic for little girls. And that felt to me like, oh, the brand wanted to make sure we understood that.
That's right. The brand overall wanted to make sure that was the truth. I want to take a quick break, Emma, to hear from one of our sponsors. Speaking of brands and how we pay for our stuff, and then we'll come right back to this discussion. I'm trusting that our sponsors also don't mind that we're digging them in the same way that Mattel didn't mind that Greta Gerwig was digging at them. We're back with Emma Gray, who's educating me about the ins and outs of the Barbie movie. We were just talking about whether the movie is subversive or actually very corporate in its treatment of Barbie and the Mattel brand. Do you think it dismisses corporate feminism or corporate portrayals of feminism, or just gives it sort of a new sheen? Is the movie sort of an agent provocateur in making everyone comfy that things are getting better and you can have it all? Or is it still in the service of a dialogue that might keep women down over time?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I feel like the jury is still out on that. I think it's really like, what are we, in a larger sense, going to do with what is offered up by Barbie? If the lesson is just go be a girl boss and look like Margot Robbie, and actually Mattel is great, then, like, that's not going to be so helpful to women. or, non-binary people or any genderqueer person. But I do think that if it can engage people who, again, wouldn't have naturally been drawn to these political concepts and these conversations, and if it can, I think, also encourage the powers that be to allow more stories that are targeted at women and girls to be told, then I think it has really great value. Because I think something that happens when we have a big splashy movie or TV show or album that speaks directly to one group who is not necessarily the dominant cultural group, we want that thing to be perfect and to speak for everyone in that group. When the reality is, what I hope this does is that it begets more stories by all different kinds of women about women, right? Like, I think that something that's so powerful about Barbie is that you see all of these groups of women and girls bringing their friends and going to it and creating this collective experience because there's a real hunger for stories that speak to us. And it's not going to work for every woman and every girl. It's not going to land for everyone. And so why aren't there just more stories to choose from that go into their creation with like that goal of engaging this group?
Here's hoping that that happens, especially because the dudes in Hollywood have finally discovered that you can have a tentpole summer movie entirely built for women instead of 17-year-old boys.
Exactly.
And it can rake in lots of money at the box office.
I mean, my God, Barbie boosted Oppenheimer, not the other way around.
That's right. One of the other recent developments that I found really interesting and fascinating and encouraging was the fact that they're screening Barbie in Saudi Arabia. And this is sort of part and parcel with what you were just discussing and your great observation about how stories can be liberating if they're told often enough and broadly enough. And there are other Arab states that are not allowing Barbie to be screened there. And you had this phenomenon of one of the most, structurally sexist societies on the planet allowing a movie to be screened that is expressly anti-sexist. And I feel like that's a measure of both progress and the power of great art.
Yes. And I think in a lot of these more closed communities, you need these Trojan horse cultural products in order to get those narratives across. And I think that there is a value in making something accessible and fun and feminism can be really fun and joyful.
And liberating.
And liberating at the same time.
For men and women.
Yes.
Or LGBTQ people, anybody, that it's just know thyself is a liberating notion.
Absolutely. And Alan's. I love Alan.
So I want to get to Alan. But before we get to Alan, there's another character I want to talk about because I still have not reached conclusions about the meaning of some of these other characters. We talked earlier about Barbie escaping from her box at Mattel headquarters, and then she winds up in Ruth Handler's office. And Ruth Handler is the founder of Mattel and the inventor of Barbie. I was too dense to realize when the scene first began unfolding that it was Ruth Handler. My wife brought me up to speed because I'm dense. And then I became really engaged during the film with how Ruth Handler was portrayed. Here's my conflict about Ruth Handler in the movie. Is she developed Barbie out of basically a German doll who was a sex worker, literally a sex toy. And the history of the doll was she used sex work to finance a lavish lifestyle, but she still was objectified, and she was still a toy for men. And Ruth Handler thought that was great, and she'd make an American version of Build Lily, that doll, which became Barbie. She names Barbie after her own daughter. We won't even get into the ins and outs of that. And the movie doesn't get into any of that. It mentions that Ruth Handler got caught for tax evasion and that she had a double mastectomy and she eventually got run out of Mattel. But it doesn't get into any of the origins of the doll. And I feel like that's a major shortcoming. That's really something that should be grappled with. And then ultimately you get Ruth Handler as like a Dumbledorian god in a scene in which she enlightens Barbie. So that's more than I wanted to explain about my thoughts about her because I'm interested in yours. But all of that stuff really got me thinking about who she is in the movie and whether she's fully realized and taken advantage of.
I agree with everything that you're saying. I felt really conflicted about that portrayal. I did appreciate the little digs about like tax evasion. That's another story. Just a nod to the fact that this is not some perfect mythical woman. And yet, yeah, that is ultimately how she lands at the end of the movie. She is the one to release Barbie into humanity and explain to her all of the ins and outs of being a human and what you have to sacrifice to be a human. And it did feel a little incongruous with like this woman. I don't think she did feel fully realized. I don't think she did feel fully human, because I think that to make her feel fully human would be to take away that like mystical creator aura that the movie tries to put around her. And yeah, it did strike me that the Build Lily history was not included. I did wonder.
So let's riff on that.
Yeah.
Why do you think they didn't include it?
I do think that the fact that they are also aiming this movie towards kids, that they just were like, it's too much to get into the sex doll history. Let's just start after that. We get that origin story and it's just like Barbie is there. And they never touch where she came from.
Maybe that'll be the sequel, Revenge of Build Lily. It'll be a scary.
Yes, Barbie the horror movie.
See, this is why I don't work in Hollywood. They're not hiring me to write the sequel, clearly. Other characters, that were very compelling to me, both in terms of what they were meant to represent, their relationship with the brand, their relationship with people's self-understanding, were all of the discarded toys. I found that really, really fascinating. Like Midge, who's a doll I think one of my sisters had. They definitely had PJ and Skipper. But, Midge was discontinued because she was pregnant. And it was controversial to have a pregnant Barbie.
They did have like a fetus in her belly. It's weird.
Oh, I didn't know that. You could actually, like, if you took her top off, there was a fetus in there?
The belly was detachable with like a tiny baby. I think it was too creepy.
Well, I actually now get why that might have been more controversial. I thought she was merely pregnant. I didn't know there was a detachable fetus. That's as weird as the woman who had the video screen, or the doll, I should say, who had the video screen in her back.
I love that they included all of the weird Barbies and Kens that just did not land. Like, yes, the video girl, you have the Ken who was Sugar's daddy because his cat is named Sugar.
And which brings me to Alan, who also fascinated me as a character, because I don't think he's fully realized in all of his dimensions. He dukes it out with the construction dudes and shows that, sort of nebulously non-binary guy can beat the heck out of some macho construction workers. And he's the ally. He's the only real male ally of the Barbies in Barbie Land. But he kind of then just hangs out there and nothing more happens with him. And again, I felt like the film could have done more with him in the universe of issues they were trying to address.
I want an Alan movie. I think Alan is such a fascinating character, and one that when I saw the movie the first time, I was into but didn't fully appreciate. Then I saw it again and had a conversation with my friend Liz Plank, and we were talking about Alan and the way that Alan almost represents men or male-presenting people free from toxic masculinity. And both the freedom of that, like there is only one Alan. Alan knows who he is. None of the Kens know who they are. None of the Kens have any sort of independent thought or real independence. They are trapped under their relationship to Barbie and also their own masculinity. Alan is in a freer position, but also a lonelier one. He says multiple times in the movie, I'm Ken's best friend, but Ken never speaks to Alan in the whole movie. Only women speak to
Alan. Ken treats Alan the way that Barbie treats Ken.
Yes.
And the other weird history thing here that I just love is that one of the reasons Alan was discontinued as a doll in the real world was because he could wear Ken's clothes.
Oh.
Like it became controversial when the consuming public found out the Alan doll fit into Ken's clothes and it might signal that they were gay.
Yes, they were concerned that Alan didn't have a female love interest. And so they took away Alan and then brought him back with one L instead of two in the 90s as, I think, another doll's male partner. But this is the original Alan.
Yeah, maybe there's an Alan prequel that we'll write that together.
I love that. Let's do it. I'm such a fan of Alan. And I think Michael Cera did such a good job.
He was amazing. He was amazing. One other character I want to talk to you about before we take a break, although she might deserve to come back after the break too, is Gloria, America Ferrera's character. We talked earlier about how this comedy and this send-up and this work of social commentary is also very poignant and telling. And there's this great moment where Gloria is trying to buck up Barbie and her own daughter, Sasha, who she feels she has lost a connection to. And she's trying to buck them up to figure out how to reclaim Barbie land from all the Ken dudes. And she begins talking about all the duality that women have to live with, that you should be smart but not too smart, ambitious but not aggressive, pretty but not too attractive. This just tightrope of self-negating dualities that are certainly part of our history and the real world, and then are laid out across the landscape in Barbie. And I guess Gloria's character gets realized to an extent, but again, I think she's left a little bit at the door. You don't fully get to see her liberated, even though she's laying out one of, I think, the central arguments of the whole film.
Yeah, I agree. I think that in so many ways, Gloria provides the through line and the heart of this movie, but at the same time, she's more of a vehicle than a fully realized character. They don't really take the time to go into why she and her daughter are disconnected or what she ultimately wants out of that relationship. Like, we don't really understand what she craves other than basic connection. And that is compelling enough to carry the movie, but I think that they could have done more with her. She's more of like the deliverer of the thesis than anything.
Yeah, and she works at Mattel and they don't recognize her talents. It's her thoughts about death and
Oh my God, I would buy Depression Barbie, who just wants to sit in her sweats and watch the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice.
With dark clouds coming out of her head. And, she's essentially what gives rise to stereotypical Barbie, the Margot Robbie character's thoughts about death and darkness. So she's useful again as a sort of a trigger for different actions in the movie. But one of these characters I wanted to see more happen with, especially in her relationship with her daughter, Sasha.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it goes back to the fact that the real world parts were just a little less compelling than the time we spend in Barbie Land. Like, both of those parts at the beginning and the end felt so fully realized to me. Like, you could tell how much thought and care they put into building this world and what it was meant to represent and what connection it would have to our world. And then the stuff in the middle, while important to the plot, it felt a little less sharp to me.
On that note, I want to take another quick break to hear from a sponsor, and then we will come right back. I'm happy to be back with Emma Gray so we can continue this fascinating chat about the Barbie movie. Emma, stop me in my tracks if you disagree, obviously. But one of the movie's big themes is self-acceptance, I think. We've talked about this before, flaws and all. You accept yourself and you accept others. So it basically has sympathy for every single character or institution in the movie, including Ken and his bros and the Mattel dudes and Mattel as a corporation. There are a lot of virtues in forgiveness. But I also, do you think it's overly forgiving in its message?
That's interesting. I mean, I think this is a movie that allows for anger, but ultimately is more about a softer version of reconciliation. This is a movie about empathy. And I think, in my own life, I feel like there is a time for empathy and there is also a time for just anger. And sometimes it's okay to just rail against something because it's bad. But I think that is not the point of the movie. The point of the movie is to find the meaning in humanity, right? As we were talking about earlier, for Barbie to go from an idea and an object to a person. And I think the thing that differentiates humanity is empathy. And so that's really at the center. In terms of its forgiveness, the movie's forgiveness towards Ken, I actually appreciated that because I do think that there is a reading of the movie that feels a little pat, a little sort of just switch patriarchy for matriarchy and that will be better, and is kind of overly invested in the gender binary. And that I don't love. So I appreciate the empathy that the film has for Ken and the way that all of the Kens are suffering under the weight of those gendered expectations, I personally feel less empathy for Mattel than I do for the Kens. So I would be okay if, it was less forgiving towards corporate America.
Yeah, that is actually one of the themes that, not to get derailed here, but the movie Oppenheimer, I think, also wrestles with is, do we forgive or thank nuclear scientists for ushering in the atomic era and undertaking an experiment that they thought might actually torch the entire atmosphere before they realized it could be contained, but weren't sure when they did it. And I think there are some clearer dividing lines around that argument, which, bringing us back to the Barbie movie, one of its, I think, virtues, many virtues, is that she's not the doll, and the marketing of the doll and the representation of the doll and the doll's reality in people's lives isn't either or.
Right.
It does hold these two places in both being alternately imprisoning and liberating in some ways.
And I think we have to be able to acknowledge both. Like, whether or not there's a movie about her, Barbie was a dominating force, certainly in my understanding of womanhood, in the early 90s. And that conversation, Barbie was so often a site of critique and celebration at the same time. So a movie made about her also has to hold both of those things. And I think something that America Ferrera's character articulates really well, and I've heard Greta articulate this in interviews, is the fact that we as humans create toys, create dolls as avatars for ourselves. And then we get angry at those objects that we've created. And we're sort of using these things that we made, these inanimate objects, to work out our own confusion about the way that we live in real life. And that is ultimately what this movie is grappling with.
This is a question I keep asking everybody who's seen the movie, is the final scene. When Barbie is now in the real world, she has self-awareness, she knows her backstory, if not feeling fully in charge of her identity. And she's in a car with Sasha and Gloria, who are dropping her off at a nondescript and unidentified building. And I, as a viewer, assume Barbie's going to her first job. And, she zips up in the elevator. You see her approaching the receptionist. And it turns out she's there for her first appointment with her gynecologist. And it was very funny. Like, I laughed at that, and I got what it represented, that, she's no longer entirely made out of plastic, obviously, because she needs to see a gynecologist. But she's also not going in to talk about a job or, again, this issue of empowerment. And I'm not saying that going to see your gynecologist isn't empowering, or being fully in charge of your sexuality and your own health isn't fully empowering. But it was a trippy message to end the movie on. It felt like it could have gone in a different way at the end. But school me if I'm just being overly black and white here.
I actually loved it. I thought it was really funny. And also, I think something that we understand about Barbies writ large is that they all do have jobs. That's the thing that Barbie does well, is being a professional woman. That is kind of the core of her brand. And the thing that's different and new for Barbie coming to the real world is that she has a human flesh body and she needs to take care of herself. And I think another really big theme of the movie is this idea of autonomy. And when we're at a moment in our country's history where so much bodily autonomy of birthing people has been taken away and curtailed, there was something that felt like a great joke and also like a really sharp critique almost of having the final word of the Barbie movie be gynecologist.
That's great. You've enlightened me. Like a dumb Ken, you've enlightened me. I now feel Ken enough, or whatever he says.
Kenough. You're Kenough.
Kenough. Yeah, I'm Kenough. Thanks, Emma. The New Yorker had a pretty interesting article recently about the sort of the foundations of the film and how it got made. And it noted that I think Mattel now has 45 films in development based on its toys. And I think that began before Barbie came out. And Barbie has raked in so much money that I'm sure it's only going to put all of that on steroids. The suits at Mattel don't call them toys. They call them intellectual property or IP. How do you think this will play out in terms of both the quality and the lessons of future films built around this franchise of toys? Certainly Barbie gives me confidence that they're trying to do the right thing, but 45 is a lot. and commercialism has its own mandates in the United States. How do you see that playing out?
I'm definitely nervous. Like, I think that corporations are constantly taking only partial lessons or like the wrong lessons from the success of things. I mean, we see if a superhero movie does well, they're going to beat that to death, and we're only going to get superhero movies. I'm nervous we are going to go through an era where we only get movies inspired by toys. I will say, at least with toys, it's more open-ended. There's not a clear narrative. So if they do hire smart, thoughtful, talented people to create these films, I think there could be some magic in some of them. But I'm not anticipating we're going to get a banger every time. And you can tell that they're already like just putting it into a machine and trying to crank them out. Whereas I wish people looked at this movie and said, oh, look how many women and girls are desperate for stories about them. Why don't we open that up?
Yeah, and, you know, they need directors and writers of the quality of Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach,
Yes.
and brave producers like Margot Robbie. And that's a hard mix to replicate, I think.
Yeah, and I think that they had a leg up with Barbie because Barbie does have this rich, complicated history. Barbie has been central to a lot of cultural conversations in a way that I think a lot of these other toys haven't been. Like, they have not been rich sites of critique and criticism and conversation. And so I think they're going to have to work a lot harder to make those movies as interesting and as kind of inherently intriguing to audiences as the Barbie movie was.
Emma, I always like to ask guests at the end of the show, since we sort of see the pod is ideally a learning moment for people, what have you learned as a viewer of the Barbie movie, as an observer of gender and identity and the American landscape? What do you know now that you didn't know prior to seeing the Barbie movie?
Well, I now know about Alan's existence, so that was really enlightening to me. And also, I think this really drove home for me that you really can take a cultural product that is complicated, that is controversial, that is not politically perfect, and you can use it to say something real and complicated and trigger real and complex discourse. And I think that this has really redefined for me what I look at as selling out. And yeah, the ways that you can take a cultural product that might seem silly and surface level and turn it into a story that has real heart and can actually teach us something about ourselves.
Emma, I could have talked for hours more with you about all of this, but we have run out of time, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Emma Gray is the co-host of a podcast that recaps dating reality shows, Love to See It, and is the author of A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance. She's also a columnist with MSNBC, and you can find her on Twitter at Emma Lady Rose. Here at Crash Course, we believe that collisions can be messy, impressive, challenging, surprising, and always instructive. In today's Crash Course, I learned that a visit to the gynecologist's office can be far more empowering than I understood it to be. What did you learn? We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at the Bloomberg Opinion handle, @opinion, or me, @Tim O'Brien, using the hashtag Bloomberg Crash Course. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you're listening right now, and please leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. This episode was produced and inspired by the indispensable Anna Mazarakis, Moses Andam, and me. Our supervising producer is Magnus Henriksen, and we had editing help from Sage Bauman, Katie Boyce, Jeff Grocott, Mike Nitza, and Christine Vanden Beilart. Blake Maples does our sound engineering, and our original theme song was composed by Luis Guerra. I'm Tim O'Brien. We'll be back next week with another Crash Course.